Misconception number 1. The Atari 2600, ColecoVision, and other pre-NES consoles were either 2-bit or 4-bit consoles. I already sort of covered this one in clearing confusion, but I still get comments about it, so here you go. Firstly, there's no such thing as a 2-bit processor, and 4-bit processors are not used in computers like game consoles or PCs, but rather in handheld calculators. The Atari 2600, Atari 5200, and the ColecoVision are all 8-bit consoles. Misconception number 2. The ESRB play games to rate them. Not only do the ESRB not play the games they rate, but the people involved in the rating are not necessarily gamers. Developers send video footage of anything from the games that could possibly be considered objectionable, and they fill out a questionnaire, and the judges are randomly selected from a pool of anonymous employees who review the footage and questionnaires and then assign a temporary rating, which can be appealed by the developer, or they could alter the game and resubmit to get a different rating. Misconception number 3. GoldenEye 007 on the Nintendo 64 was the first first-person shooter game to have multiplayer. This one is really dumb, and it's so common that it was even included in the description of GoldenEye Source. Way before GoldenEye, PC gamers were enjoying local LAN-based multiplayer for games like Doom, Quake, and Duke Nukem 3D. The very first first-person shooter game to have multiplayer was Maze War, which came out in 1974 for PC. But you might say that GoldenEye was the first console FPS with multiplayer. You'd still be wrong. I'm not sure what the first was, but Faceball 2000, which was found on both the Game Boy and the Super NES, definitely qualifies. The Super NES version had 2-player, and believe it or not, if you had enough Game Boys, link cables, and copies of the game together, you could have a 16-player deathmatch in that version, something that no other Game Boy game was capable of. Misconception number 4. The Sega Genesis was the first 16-bit console. I hear this one a lot, and it's not even close to being true. While the Genesis certainly ushered in the 16-bit era, it was not the first 16-bit system. Some of you might think of the TurboGrafx-16, which came out a full year before the Genesis in Japan, though it came out 2 weeks after the Genesis in America. But in fact, that would also be wrong. The first 16-bit system was the Intellivision, released by Mattel to test markets in 1979 and widespread in 1980. The Intellivision is very similar to other systems that came out around the same time, such as the ColecoVision and the Atari 5200. The only difference being that the processors in the Intellivision are 16-bit. You may find this hard to believe, but remember, bits have nothing to do with graphics. Misconception number 5. Video games are more expensive now than ever. Actually, the price of a new video game hasn't changed all that much since the mid-90s, and considering the high development cost of modern games compared to games from the 90s or earlier, it's really amazing that they're still only around $60 or less. In fact, many games were more expensive back in the day due to the fact that back then, retailers did not often stick to the MSRP and had heavy markup. A copy of Chrono Trigger could cost you $80, for example, and the inexplicably popular Earthbound often went for even more. Everything is a lot more uniform now since there are so many stores, including online ones, selling video games, and they can't really get away with charging more. Misconception number 6. The Sega Genesis was Sega's first console. This one mainly comes from people who never heard of the Master System, which is mostly Americans, as the Master System was not popular at all in America. European or Australian gamers would be scandalized to hear this. But even the Master System was not the first Sega console. That honor would belong to the SG-1000, which was released in 1983 in Japan and Oceania. It was never released in Europe or America. The hardware was later updated as the SG-1002, which had come out the next year in Japan, and then the year after in Japan the SG-1000 Mark III, which was later renamed the Master System. The SG-1000 was not a huge success, boasting only about 60 games. Misconception number 7. If a company's logo is on a game box, this means they made the game. This is part of the confusion that people have between publishers and developers. Developers make the game, and publishers market and publish it. The publisher is usually the one to have their logo on the box, but it doesn't mean they created the game. Publishers are usually more well known than developers, which is why the publisher is used for marketing purposes. For example, let's take the game Bayonetta. It had a big Sega logo on it, but the developer was actually Platinum Games for the Xbox 360 and Nex Entertainment for the PS3 version. While most hardcore gamers know the developers they like, the average gamer only knows the bigger companies, which are publishers, so putting the Sega logo on the box makes sense. Keep in mind, however, that some developers do self-publish their games. Misconception number 8. The ESRB is a government agency and all games must be rated. The ESRB was not created by the government, but in fact was created as a reaction to it. In the 90s, some violent video games like Mortal Kombat and Night Trap were causing a moral panic with some people, and there was talks of the government intervening in the video game industry by censoring it. The ESRB is a private organization created to combat this by allowing the game industry to self-regulate itself with a rating system, much like the MPAA does for the movie industry. It was not mandatory to have a game rated by the ESRB, but many publishers chose not to publish unrated games, and the two biggest distributors of games, Walmart and GameStop, refused to carry unrated games. Misconception number 9. E.T. for the Atari 2600 sold poorly. I actually covered this extensively in Urban Legends of Video Gaming, but it's worth mentioning again. E.T. was a critical failure, but not a commercial failure, and it was one of the top-selling games for the Atari, selling 1.5 million copies, regardless of what you've heard. It didn't cause the gaming industry crash by being bad and selling poorly, but it did contribute to it by being bad and having people start to think that video games in general are bogus. And people saying that most copies were returned or that they were all buried in a landfill do not know what they're talking about. And misconception number 10, Ms. Pac-Man is the sequel to Pac-Man. The story behind this is actually rather involved, but I'll try and get through it quickly. Pac-Man was developed by Namco, and the American version was published by Midway. Midway wanted Namco to produce a sequel quickly, but it was taking a long time, so they went ahead and developed their own game, Ms. Pac-Man, which was marketed as the sequel to Pac-Man, even though Namco had nothing to do with it. The official sequel to Pac-Man is actually Super Pac-Man, and Namco normally refuses to acknowledge the existence of Ms. Pac-Man. What's most interesting is that Ms. Pac-Man was based on an illegal hack of Pac-Man called Evil Otto. The guys who made Evil Otto were contracted by Midway to make the unofficial sequel.